Having drunk deep of the cup of wisdom, I looked into the hearts of men, and there found I greater mysteries, and was glad. For only in the search for truth could my soul be stilled, and the flame within be quenched. Down through the ages I lived, seeing those around me taste of the cup of death, and return again in the light of life. Gradually from the kingdom of Atlantis passed waves of consciousness that had been one with me, only to be replaced by spawn of a lower star. Hello there. You can tell by the way people use the word self in spiritual circles that humanity does not know who he is. And the reason is that human beings are captured by the oscillation of the different characters and masks that have crystallized inside of them, to such an extent that they live in a sphere of masks that they are unable to really put on and see through, but they become active and capture the identity energy of that person. So they cannot see themselves by wearing the mask properly, and they have also lost contact with the second story. They're stuck between the second and third floor, and I can only conjecture that if they don't sort that problem out, they will perish. My teacher talked sometimes about the ego, that it had been used as a scapegoat. In the same way, people are always trying to stop their mind, but they don't even know what the mind is, nor do they investigate. And as for the Buddhists, they look inside themselves and have decided that they don't exist. The answers are not pouring out. And the reason is that we are in a difficult situation, since we already have masks on our face, and they are blinding us. If we try to heal ourselves, we are not healing a car that is outside. We have to heal ourselves, so we are simultaneously the patient and the doctor. And there are no instruction manuals. Well, after that I will read something out from Fritz. It's about Gurdjieff's view of astrology, and I also have the train story, which I might attach to the end. While it is difficult to give any general examples of Gurdjieff's method of teaching, I do remember one instance which, when I think back on it, seems to me to embody a great many aspects of the manner in which he worked. At one time, and as a part of a general discussion on the deterioration of knowledge and science in the modern world, Gurdjieff brought up the subject of astrology. He claimed that many centuries ago it had been a really genuine science, and very different from the present-day conception of astrology. As an example of the way in which it had been civilized and misinterpreted, he said that the astrological signs were originally invented to synthesize the particular characteristics against which a given individual would have to fight or to struggle in the course of life on Earth. He said that an individual born under the sign of the influence of Aries, the ram, should properly remember that the ram was a symbol of the characteristics of his nature against which he should struggle in order to achieve harmony and balance within himself. Scorpio, in this interpretation, the female kills the male when mating has been accomplished, could generally be interpreted as a killing sign, although he did not mean killing in a physical sense. He went on to point out that Pisces and Gemini were the two obvious dual signs, but that they represented two different kinds of duality. In Pisces, it is warring duality, two fishes tied together, but struggling to break the bond between themselves. In other words, Pisceans have to struggle against a self-divisive tendency in their own natures. Gemini, on the contrary, represented a merging duality, and the struggle was against ingrowingness and towards separation. Sagittarius has to struggle against destructiveness, the arrow aimed against the world, and so on. The straightforward, simple method being to find out what your sign symbolized in your mind and relate it to your natural characteristics. Gurdjieff did not discuss all the signs in detail, but suggested that once one could discover for oneself what the sign symbolized or represented in the way of characteristics or compulsions in oneself, then one would have to remind oneself that such a synthesis represented those elements against which one would have to fight throughout. What might be called the built-in obstacles in one's own nature that were part of the key to self-perfection or growth, the necessary obstacles standing in the path to development. I'm just going to break here because I've had a couple of thoughts. One is that we are born as part of the structure of existence, and so that is the descending ray. As this world emerges out of the absolute, it is created according to certain forms, and we are born within it. And therefore we have particular phenomena as part of our existence that we have to struggle with. They are the characteristics with which we live. We are born inside a vehicle, if you like, that has particular characteristics, and our role and our job and our work is ourselves. Although human beings project their work, their existential work outside, and they create businesses and so on, the real work is always inside. Fritz says, he added that, as was usual in all great ancient sciences, the lesson was never clearly stated but could only be learnt with effort, and that a great part of the problem in astrology was the individual's particular interpretation of the meaning of his sign for himself. Going back to Aries as a convenient example, he said that it was not only that persons born under this sign would have to struggle against their tendency to ram in various circumstances and situations, but that it would also depend upon the interpretation of ramming and their personal analysis and understanding of the ways in which this compulsive characteristic was manifested. The sign, in other words, was an indication for all persons born under it, but since each person differed individually, it would be necessary for them to find out for themselves in what particular ways the sign manifested in their individuality. Gurdjieff warned that in the particular, individual search and analysis of such characteristics a clue usually could be found if one was able to observe objectively the characteristics within oneself to which one is inordinately attached. He said that while it was very hard to observe one's personal prejudices and pleasing characteristics with real objectivity, it was nevertheless necessary to do so in order to evaluate oneself correctly. In this, other people could be useful, as through them it was possible to observe the effects of one's own recurring individual manifestations. One way to discover those things within oneself to which we are attached, which we like, and of which we are proud, is the frequency of their repetition in outward manifestations, in dealing with other people. Such recurrent manifestations could be the first clue to our vanities, which in turn should be interpreted in relation to the characteristics of our astrological sign. In an attempt to give an easily comprehensible hypothetical example, and a very obvious one, he said that if a given individual should observe that in his dealings with other people he manifested a certain persistent, recurring insistence on having his own way, and that such a person turned out to be someone who was born under the sign of Aries, the implication is fairly obvious. Learn how, consciously, not to insist. If a Piscean was also insisting in this sense, the insistence might be interpreted as a one-sided insistence, and it might be necessary to learn consciously to insist with the other half of one's nature. If a person born under the sign of Aries can learn not to insist in his dealings with other people, he would at least have learned the possibility of not being insistent in his own self-struggles towards growth or development. Any recurring manifestations is of necessity a form of blindedness, in that the repetitive manifestations by its very operation prevents conscious activity. I'll just break there and say that when we are born, it may be that there are no characters formed, but they are coming, because there is a subconscious, and as we interact with this world, partly in our interactions with this world, which may appear spontaneous, and partly simply as the necessary unfolding of our own subconscious, our characters start to form. And in my opinion, as humanity does not really understand anything about its characters, most human beings live their lives with the alternation of many characters, like a carousel of different faces that passes across them, and they have not the slightest clue that is happening. Because human beings do not know it's happening, they do not know how to deal with the situation properly. And what happens is the crystallization increases and increases, forming more characters with deeply etched habits, until a kernel of very deeply ingrained characters is formed, and that forms the chief feature or the axle of that false personality. And that is maybe one, possibly